I'd like to continue our discussion of the true plants today, the kingdom Euplantae, first talking about the division Lycophyta. And the Lycophidans are the club mosses. There aren't that many up there, but there are a few around, so I want to go ahead and be sure and discuss them. So club mosses are not true mosses. They're another example of a plant that's structurally pretty complex in that they are tracheophytes, and also primitive in terms of life cycle. So they require water for fertilization. So they're kind of similar to the ferns in that way. So again, another plant that is not a seed-producing plant. So when we look at the club mosses, again, we're looking at a sporophyte plant. So again, they do have true leaves, true stems, and true roots. And so this would all be sporophyte plant. And again, the sporophyte's job is to make spores. And what's a little different with them compared to the ferns is that they produce structures called strobili. And the term strobili, or strobilus would be singular, is Latin for a cone. And so a cone actually is composed of modified leaves. When we call these modified leaves sporophylls. So the suffix phyll is for leaf, and it's a leaf that's going to produce spores. So this is a structure that we'll come back to when we discuss the conifer life cycle, because the cones and conifers actually have some similarities to this. All right. So again, we're looking at a plant that's sporophyte dominant. So when you look at the club moss, you're seeing a diploid sporophyte plant. So again, the strobilus then is Latin for a cone. The strobilus is composed of modified leaves called sporophylls. So leaves that make spores. And so within the leaves then, that's where the sporangia will be generated. And within the sporangia, meiosis occurs, and that's where the spores are produced. So, and again, all of this tissue would be diploid tissue, and then spores will be haploid. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting about the club mosses, and that we'll talk about when we get to the conifers, is that they are heterosporous, meaning that they have different types of spores. They have male spores, essentially, and female spores that develop into male gametophytes and female gametophytes. So if we were to look at a longitudinal section, a section through one of those strobili that I showed you a couple of seconds ago then, we would see the sporangia with the spores inside, and here are the sporophylls. So again, the individual sporophylls, the sporangium, so different types of sporangia. And you'll notice that some of those spores are really big and some of the spores are really small. So we refer to the small spores as microspores, the large spores as megaspores. So microspores and megaspores. So as we look at this kind of terminology, then the term prefix micro means small, but it's also a reference to maleness. So in this Lycophyta, then the little cones, the strobila, will produce spores, either microspores or megaspores. And so the microspores, when they germinate, will give rise to microgametophytes. So they will germinate, as we've talked about before, if conditions are right, and those will grow into free-living gametophytes. And we call those microgametophytes because they were derived from the smaller spores, the microspores. The microgametophytes then will produce antheridia on their surface. And as we know, antheridia produce sperm. So again, they will produce free-living gametophytes, much like the ferns. Those will have antheridia on the surface. Those rupture, and the sperm swim away. So the sperm have to, again, swim to find the ovum. Now, the megaspores, on the other hand, will under the right conditions, germinate, and again develop into gametophytes, but this time we call it a megagametophyte. And again, here the prefix mega means big, but it's also a reference to female when we're speaking botanically. So the megagametophyte will be a free-living gametophyte. It's not necessarily bigger than a microgametophyte. It's just a quote-unquote female gametophyte. And on that megagametophyte will develop archegonia. And we have already discussed that within archegonia, ova develop. So again, it would be similar in the ferns that we have a free-living gametophyte with archegonia. And again, sperm are going to have to swim down the top of the archegonium and fertilize the ovum. And then the fertilized ovum will develop into a zygote. The zygote will grow into a new club moss, a new sporophyte, and in so doing will obliterate the megagametophyte. So again, the prefix micro is referencing male. Mega is referencing female. And the primary genus that we see up there in the Yellowstone ecosystem is the genus Lycopodium. So kind of the last non-seed producing plant I want to discuss from the Yellowstone ecosystem are the horsetails, the division Spinophyta. And again, they're tracheophytes, they're sporophyte dominant, but it also require water for fertilization. So again, a non-seed producing plant, so we, like mosses, club mosses, we tend to find them in wetter habitats. So horsetails, again, are a pretty common plant up there in the wetter areas. It's also a pretty common ornamental plant, so hopefully you've seen horsetails before. But again, they do have a vegetative component, and also they reproduce somewhat similarly to the club mosses we just talked about, in that they do produce a cone, a strobolus. The strobolus will be composed of sporophylls that produce spores and develop into gametophytes, but they do not have kind of separate sexes in terms of the spores. So these are homosporous. All of the spores will be the same. You can't tell male and female spores from one another. But again, important thing is that they are tied to aquatic areas or wet areas, humid areas, because they require water for fertilization. Okay. And again, the common horsetail is one that we find up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and the genus is Equisetum. All right, so next I want to move into the seed-producing plants. So there are two subkingdoms of seed-producing plants, the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms. Now, both of these groups are seed-producing plants. So the rest of the plants we're going to talk about and the dominant vegetation that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem are seed-producing plants. And what goes along with being a seed producer is that pollen is used for fertilization. And this is an important adaptation because now water is no longer required for fertilization. Plants are still going to need water. They need their roots to tap into water, keep the plant hydrated. But as gymnosperms and later angiosperms evolved then, this allowed them to move into drier habitats because they no longer had to have water for fertilizing the egg. So this was a major adaptation in plant history. So when we look at the structure of a seed, well, what makes a seed a seed? Well, the seed will include an embryonic plant, an embryonic sporophyte. So this is the baby tree, if you will, if we're talking about something like a lodgepole pine. In addition to that, there will be a material called endosperm, and the endosperm will either be haploid tissue or triploid tissue, and the endosperm provides nutrients to the developing embryo. So, and that's one of the reasons why we animals like to eat seeds, because the endosperm has all of this nutrition in it. There will also be a protective seed coat or seed coats that will typically be diploid. And then also one of the things that I want you to remember as we look at these life cycles is that one ovule will develop into one seed. So that's an important concept that I'll come back to a couple of times. So again, as we look at a seed, then we have the embryonic plant. We have the endosperm, which provides the nutrients to that, and the endosperm will develop from gametophyte tissue potentially. So it will be haploid. It also may be triploid, and we'll talk about that in the flowering plants. In flowering plants, the endosperm is triploid. In the gymnosperms, it's haploid. And then again, seed coats around that, and together that constitutes the seed. And so the advantage of seeds is that you do have this protective layer. When the young plant is beginning to grow, the young sporophyte is beginning to grow, it has kind of a head start because it's being provided with nutrients from the endosperm. Hopefully that gets it up out of the leaf litter. And if there's enough sunlight and other nutrients, then it can make it on its own. Also, seeds can live, a long time in some cases, centuries perhaps, and maybe even thousands of years in some cases. Okay, so as we look at characteristics of the subkingdom Gymnospermi first, they are tracheophytes, so they are vascular plants. They do not require water for fertilization because they're going to use pollen. They're sporophyte dominant, so when you look at a lodgepole pine, you're looking at the sporophyte. And again, we'll be back in this life cycle over and over and over again and coming back to that. They fertilize via pollen, as I already mentioned. They are seed-producing plants. And what distinguishes them in some ways from the angiosperms is that the seeds develop within cones, or in some types of gymnosperms, the seeds will be naked. But the types that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the seeds will be protected by cones. All right, so as we look at the subkingdom Gymnospermi then, we're going to look at the primary division that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which would be the conifers, the Coniferophyta. So we'll be looking at the conifers, and I want to go through that life cycle first. So when we look at the conifer life cycle then, you've got the pine tree. And again, we'll kind of use the lodgepole pine as the example here. So when you're looking at the lodgepole pine tree, that's the sporophyte plant. And initially, the role of that sporophyte plant is to produce spores. And so conifers produce cones. And so in the case of the lodgepole pine, it will produce male cones and female cones. And we're going to look first at the male cones. So I want to show you first kind of what the size of a male cone, what it looks like. So the male cones, and this isn't from a lodgepole pine, but it is from a local pine here in Southern California. But anyway, you can see that these are the male cones. They're relatively small, so you can see it's not much bigger than my fingernail. And they grow in clusters called catkins. So these are going to be the pollen-producing structures on the pine tree. And most pine trees will have both sexes. They'll have male cones and female cones. So again, the male cone is also called a microstrobilus. It is a modified bud, so we have leaves here that are modified for producing spores. So this staminate cone then is also called a microstrobilus. It's composed of modified leaves, which would be the microsporophylls. Within the microsporophylls will be microsporangia. Within the microsporangia, spores will be produced, so that's where meiosis is going to occur. And these are the microspores. And the microspores will be one nucleus. So they're going to be haploid. They'll also have a single nucleus. And the difference between a spore and a gametophyte basically is that a gametophyte is multicellular. So these microspores are immature pollen grains. And at some point within this microstrobilus, the pollen grain will undergo a nuclear division. And at that point, we refer to it as a microgametophyte. So the microspore then becomes a microgametophyte when it divides once. And so microgametophytes will also be pollen grains, but they're mature pollen grains, and they have two nuclei, a tube nucleus and a generative nucleus, which I'll get back to later. Okay, so looking first at these microspores then. The microspores are immature pollen grains. They will have a single nucleus. Again, microgametophytes are considered mature pollen grains. They will have two nuclei, one being the tube nucleus, one being the generative nucleus. And the generative nucleus is the one that eventually does the fertilizing. So the modified leaf with the spores inside. So all of this tissue is diploid tissue, this outer tissue. The spores themselves would be haploid. And again, kind of emphasizing this then, as we look at a magnification of pollen grains within a male cone, some of them will have two nuclei, so that would be a microgametophyte. And others have a single nucleus, that would be a microspore. So microspores will undergo one mitotic division. At that point, we consider it a microgametophyte. And then again, as these cones open up, they rupture, the pollen grains then are caught by the wind. And this is one of the things that you'll notice in the conifer pollen grains. They do have these wing-like structures associated with them. And so conifers wind pollinate. They don't use any kind of an insect for pollinating. It's all about the wind. And it's amazing sometimes when you go up there that you'll just see just clouds of pollen. It's unbelievable how much energy these plants are putting into reproduction. So the pollen grains then are disseminated in the wind, and then they're going to be carried, hopefully, to a female cone. So in another part of the, hopefully not the same tree, but on some of the lodgepole pines, we'll be developing female cones. And so, you know, normally when you think of a pine cone, we're thinking of a large cone, but initially they start off very, very small. So in the first year, they're basically kind of reddish looking, and you'll find again these at the end of stems, but the female cones are going to be very small. They're going to be sappy and sticky. And so again, it's a modified bud. It's going to be composed of sporophylls, this time megasporophylls. And what will develop at the base of each sporophyll will be a oval mass of tissue, and we refer to this oval mass of tissue as an ovule. And within that ovule will develop a sporangium, and within that sporangium will develop a single large spore, a megaspore, which will be the haploid tissue. So again, the ovulate cone then is composed of modified leaves. So here are modified leaves, which are the megasporophylls. And within those, oval masses of tissue are formed, which are the ovules. Within the ovule, we'll develop a single haploid cell, the megaspore. The megaspore will then undergo mitotic division within the ovule to form a megagametophyte. So again, this is, and so it will begin to divide right within the ovule, and then it will expand here. So it's going to be multicellular, but it's not going to be very big. So this is a bit of an oxymoron. So when we talk about a megagametophyte, basically the word is saying it's a big gametophyte, but really it's a tiny, tiny gametophyte. So the megagametophyte is contained within the ovule at the base of a scale of a cone. So the scale, the megasporophyll basically is one of the scales of a cone. And then within that megagametophyte, we'll develop a single ovum. So this isn't really showing us that ovum, but again, we would have an ovum within an ovule at the base of a sporophyll or a scale of the cone. And at this point, again, the cone itself would be quite small, and it would not be hard yet. It would be very succulent. It would just be vegetative type tissue. So this is a slide showing us a section through a female cone. So again, here's one of the scales of what will eventually be the scales of the cone. This is one of the sporophylls. Again, we're looking at the ovule here. And then the megagametophyte is going to be developing within the ovule. And eventually an ovum within that megagametophyte. So again, we've got pollen grains that have been scattered into the wind. And we have an ovum, which is at the base of a scale of a cone. In fact, every scale of the cone will have an ovule that contains the megagametophyte and an ovum within. So somehow the pollen grains have to get to that and fertilize the ovum within the ovule. So again, when we'll carry the pollen, this female cone, the megastrobilus, is initially sticky, so the pollen grains will stick in that. And then as the plant dehydrates slightly, the sap will shrink, and that will pull the pollen grains in between the scales of the cone. And so the pollen grains get close now to the ovules where the ovum is. So again, pollen grains are going to be pulled in here, and so they're close, but they're still not to where the ovum is going to be. So this is where the two nuclei come in. So the pollen grain, the mature pollen grain, you may recall, has a tube nucleus and a generative nucleus. And so what the pollen grain begins to do then is that it begins to elongate. It has to grow and elongate and reach the ovum within the ovule. So again, we have a generative nucleus, a tube nucleus, and so the tube nucleus basically drives this mechanism, but the tube nucleus will cause elongation of the pollen grain. So the pollen grains elongate. And along the way, the generative nucleus will mitotically divide to form two sperm nuclei. So again, this pollen grain will elongate, penetrate the ovule, and enter the megagametophyte to where the ovum is. And one of these two sperm nuclei will fertilize the ovum. And the tube nucleus really will have no role in actual fertilization. One of these two sperm nuclei will fertilize the ovum, the other one will die. The tube nucleus also eventually just dies. So again, if we were kind of looking at this process, then the pollen grain has been pulled in close. It will elongate, grow to where the ovum is, and fertilize the ovum. One of the two sperm nuclei will fertilize the ovum. So as we look at the sperm nuclei then, or in the tube nucleus will die, one of the sperm nuclei will die, and then one of the sperm nuclei will fertilize the ovum, and in so doing produce a zygote, which will be a diploid cell. And then the zygote will mitotically divide then to form the embryonic sporophyte, the next generation. So this will be the baby tree, if you will. And that embryo then, that embryonic plant, and of course that'll be through mitotic division, so that embryonic plant then will be within the seed. And so the embryonic plant is within the ovule, it's diploid. The surrounding gametophyte tissue will develop into the endosperm, that'll be haploid tissue. And then the surrounding ovual tissue, which is diploid, will develop into the seed coats. And in the conifers, the seed coat typically produces a wing-like structure. And so when that female cone finishes its growth and opens up, the seeds are released, and hopefully wind will take them away from the canopy being from underneath the mother tree, or animals may pick them up and carry them away. And if they don't end up digesting them, the seeds may germinate on their own. So again, the ovum develops into the embryo, the gametophyte tissue into the endosperm, which will provide nutrition to the embryo, and then the surrounding ovual tissue, which is diploid, will develop into the seed coats of the seed. And that's all happening at the base of the scale of a cone. So when we look at the life cycle of a lodgepole pine then, it's really a 2+ year cycle. So what tends to happen in the first year, pollen grains are produced, they're released from the male cones, they're carried by wind, and they stick in the sap of the female cone, will be pulled into the interior, and will fertilize the ovum at the base of the scales of the female cone. So that's pretty much what happens in that first summer. Then the plant becomes inactive over the winter, and then the following spring then, that's when the growth of the cone will occur. The cone will get larger, and then possibly at the end of the second year, sometimes the third year, the cone will eventually dry, open up, and release the seeds. Now another characteristic of the lodgepole pine is that a lot of those cones will not open at all, and they're not known as serotinous cones. And so the serotinous cones stay closed unless they are heated. So they're part of the fire cycle of the Yellowstone ecosystem. So some of those cones will not open unless they are heated, and once they are heated by fire, then they open up. And so the idea here for the plant is that if there is fire, that's going to burn off the upper canopy. That will create more sunlight and give the seeds an opportunity to survive. Okay, so I would next like to go ahead and discuss some of the specific conifers that we find up in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And we taped kind of an introduction to the conifers actually up in Yellowstone last summer. So I'd like you to go ahead and take a look at that introduction right now. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is actually composed of a number of specific types of ecosystems, and I'm standing in one of those now, a conifer forest. So I want to give a brief overview of the different types of conifers that we find in this particular ecosystem. And while it may seem like a lot, it's actually relatively few as far as ecosystems go. So conifers tend to have either needle-like leaves or scale-like leaves, and they bear cones, either hard cones or berry-like cones. So there are 4 general types of conifers that we find in this ecosystem. One would be the pines. Pines bear needles in fascicles or bundles. The next 2, both firs and spruces, bear single needles, and we'll talk about the differences later. And then our last group would be the junipers, which have either needle-like leaves or scale-like leaves and a berry-like cone. In addition to the pines, firs, and spruces that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are also 2 junipers. Junipers are conifer relatives, but instead of producing a kind of hard cone, they produce a berry-like cone, so-called juniper berries. So junipers tend to have, again, a succulent cone and either scale-like or needle-like leaves. So the 2 types of junipers that we have in the Yellowstone ecosystem, one is shrub-like with needle-like leaves, and that's the mountain juniper. And then another one is a tree juniper that has scale-like leaves. That's the Rocky Mountain juniper that you see behind me here. So, mountain juniper, short name, short plant. Long name, Rocky Mountain juniper, tall plant. That's one of the ways to keep them straight. Okay, so again, just kind of summarizing there what you saw, then as we look at the conifers, we can have the berry-like cones with scales or needle-like leaves, which would be our junipers, and we learned about a couple of those. And then also non-succulent cones or needle-like leaves will be pines, spruces, or firs. And then again, reviewing the junipers real briefly then. So scale-like leaves, that is a tree, would be the Rocky Mountain juniper. Needle-like leaves and a shrub, the mountain or common juniper. And also then, here's a picture actually showing what the juniper cones look like, the juniper berries look like. So this is actually on a mountain juniper. Okay, now looking at other types of conifers then. If there are single needles, that will either be a spruce or a fir. And if needles are in what we call fascicles, that will be a pine. And so fascicles, so again, here we look at single needles, and also they can be in bundles. And so bundles would be these fascicles. And so if it's a fascicle, we'll either see groups of 2 needles or 5 needles. So as we look at this combination then, single needles versus needles and fascicles, if it's a single needle, it can either be square in cross-section and sharp, in which case it is a spruce, or the needle may be flat in cross-section or dull, in which case it is a fir. And the pines then would also be in fascicles. So pines then, if the needles are in a fascicle or a group of 2, the only pine up there that has a fascicle of 2 needles is the lodgepole pine. And if it is a fascicle composed of 5 needles, that would either be a limber pine or a white bark pine. And again, the lodgepole pine is going to be the dominant pine up there. And again, the 5 needles would be limber pine or white bark pine. So if it has a fascicle of 5 needles in, if it has a cone that is green or brown, 3.5 inches or longer, that will be a limber pine. And if the cone is purple and less than 3.5 inches, then that would be a white bark pine. And we'll talk more about white bark pines later in the course. Spruces, if the cone is greater than 3 inches, it's a blue spruce. And if the cone is less than 3 inches, it will be an Engelmann spruce. And I actually have some of the Engelmann blue and Engelmann cones here, so you can take a look at the size difference here. So again, there's quite a difference in size between the blue spruce and the Engelmann spruce. And we tend to find the spruces along the canyons, all through the ecosystem, but especially in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And then our firs, if they are brown cones that have kind of a distinctive trident associated with the cone, and the cones hang down, that would be a Douglas fir. And if they have purple erect cones, that would be a subalpine fir. And so this is what the subalpine fir cones look like. So that was kind of a quick run through, but I'll continue this discussion in our next module. See you next time.